bit.
Sure, let's get going.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, and welcome again to one of our Cyber Hawaii and Cyber Readiness Institute's webinars. Really good to see everyone on this call. As you know, thinking back, we've been doing these webinar partnerships with CRI since about March when the pandemic hit. And back then, it really was about looking at how we're going to quickly move to a remote workforce, with many people having to pivot during this pandemic. And now looking back and looking forward here 8 months later, we realized that working from home, learning from home, everyone in the same environment, and possibly also going into the workplace physically is not just something we're doing for the pandemic. It's going to be the new business as usual. So this is a bit of a 2.0 webinar. How do we make those adjustments that will be sustainable and allow our workplaces to thrive in this particular environment? So we're very fortunate to once again have our amazing community partners joining us and helping us to promote this event to their members. So wanted to just give a shout out to the Hawaii Small Business Development Center, the Hawaii Chamber of Commerce, the Hawaii Island Chamber of Commerce, the Hawaii Island Economic Development Board, Maui Economic Development Board, and the Hawaii Business Roundtable. Truly appreciate their support and help in making sure that we get this needed information and opportunity out to people throughout the state. So at this time, let's just go quickly through our panel members that we have here today. We're very blessed that we have experts within Cyber Hawaii's leadership teams. So today presenting will be Maverick Fernandez, Director of Information Security Office at Kamehameha Schools. Thank you, Maverick, for always being a willing and able participant with Cyber Hawaii. And Tim Minnick, Director of Information Technology at Pacific Guardian Life, another very valued resource. So very much appreciate our Cyber Hawaii members for always helping us with these webinars. And with that, Craig, I'll turn it over to you to basically get this started.
Great, thanks very much, Jill. So what we want to cover today is really looking broadly at the challenges that the hybrid workplace brings to you in terms of cyber security and cyber readiness. And we're going to take a quick look through the issues related to people, process, and technology. And we're going to close with a little bit on ransomware because there's been an enormous increase in the amount of ransomware attacks based on the pandemic. So that's what we're going to cover. We are going to use some polling techniques. So during part of this, we're going to ask you to answer some questions. We'll share the results with you, and that's going to help me and Maverick and Tim better address the things that are concerning you. So just really quickly, background on us. We're a not-for-profit. We bring together global companies to really look at best practices for cyber readiness for small, mid-sized business. And that's our focus, is on small, mid-sized business. We develop free content. So everything that we provide and develop goes out for free because we get funding and support from these organizations. So these organizations, MasterCard, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, GM, Principal Finance, are really focused on trying to help small businesses because small businesses all are connected together. And so the funding comes from them to us. That enables us to develop great content that we can share with you for free. This is the oh no moment. And one of the things that we see with cyber over and over is the problems that occur, but usually in the paper, it's always about the big company. And what I want all of you to be aware of, it's not just big companies. So here's the average size of a breach. The fact that 67% of small companies fail to survive a breach is something that you got to keep in mind. And then the other thing is 56% suffered a breach caused by a third party. So you might think, why would a hacker want to go after you? They might not want to go after you. They might be using you as a gateway to get to another company. Conversely, the companies that you work with could be a gateway to get into you for a hacker. And then the type of free content that we have a cyber readiness program, which is really the most comprehensive thing that we do. And it's an e-learning that helps you to improve cyber readiness for your organization. we produce a series of guides and tips, some of which I'm going to reference today. We have a starter kit, and then two new things we're doing: a cyber leader certification program. So the cyber leader could get a personal credential as somebody that is knowledgeable about leading cyber readiness. And then, in part, in response to requests from our friends at Cyber Hawaii, we're going to be developing employee cyber readiness training. Some really, really short, like 90-second, 2-minute long courses that employees could use to educate them on some of the basics. So with that, let's dig into the real content that we're going after. So the first polling question is, Vivek is going to put up a polling question. We're going to give you a minute to answer, and then we'll show the results. So each of you, if you could just answer, take a quick look at this. And this is really about where you're letting people work. Is it just at back at the office or the store or the factory? Is it only remote, or is it a hybrid? And what we see overall is that it clearly is transitioning to a hybrid. Maverick, while we're waiting for response here, what do you see about this? Or what about with your organization and the schools?
Well, as you know, we've had a hybrid, and we've kind of had to manage it based on what the community has been experiencing, especially in the education space. So initially, when we started the school year, it was remote. As conditions improved, and it depended on the islands, because we have 3 campuses on 3 different islands.
Mm-hmm.
We've had to adjust based on the islands. And then the other thing that's also critical is determining essential workers, and how do we support the essential workers that support the core business. So those are the things that are key drivers for us.
So Tim, let me ask you, what do you see? We see here that it's a huge percent are doing hybrid of the attendees. Tell us a little bit about what you see here or what your company's doing.
Sure. So since the pandemic began, I've actually had a fairly broad palette of organizations that I've been involved with. So, in education and in profit and nonprofit, a mix of essential companies, providing essential services, and non-essential. And, it is very much, it's still evolving at this point. Early on, it was a 911 situation, and organizations had to do what they had to do to survive, and business continuity. Mm-hmm. And now this is the renaissance, where we have the opportunity to go back and do the things that we would have done the first time around had we had the time and resources. So I see everyone that I'm working with in my circles, they're definitely settling into a more formalized, policy-driven hybrid environment as well. And everybody seems to be the consensus that, like Jill mentioned earlier, indeed, this is the new way. Yeah. This isn't going to be a point in time change.
That's for sure. So Vivek, thanks for that. Let's close out that poll. So when we talk about cyber readiness, basically, we look at 4 core issues: passwords, software updates, phishing, and USBs and removable media. And if you get better and get your employees better at those 4 things, you're going to radically reduce the potential for attack. That's the preventative side of it. And then the other thing is, cyber readiness is knowing what to do if there's an incident. And everybody knows what to do if they see a fire in their office or at their home. You know what to do, and you can quickly gauge the severity of the fire. Is it something you can just throw a cup of water on it? Is it something you need to call the fire department? So we want people to get to that level of basic understanding, prevention, and then know what to do if there is an incident. So in the hybrid environment, with people shifting back and forth, as Tim mentioned, in the beginning, it was a shift. It was all focused on business continuity because people were rushing to get people working remotely. But now with this new reality, there is the need to update policies and change behavior. And that's something that we're going to come back to in a minute, is to talk a little bit about the behavioral aspect of it. Here's a cartoon that I like to use. And this was in the New Yorker, and this was probably like back in April, right, early days of the pandemic. And for health and safety reasons, we'll be transitioning to cybercrime. And this has happened. There is an enormous increase in cybercrime, 700% increase. Some of the larger companies that we work with are having companies in their supply chain attacked with ransomware on a routine basis. So when we think about the hybrid workplace, what I'm going to talk about and what Tim and Maverick and I are going to share with you is thinking about people. So what's the change in behavior that's needed? Process. What are the changes in policies? And how do you set clear expectations for employees? And technology. What are some of the basic technologies that you could use to improve cybersecurity? So with that, let me stick back on this one. Let me start with you, Maverick, again. When you look at these three things, people, process, and technology in the hybrid environment, tell us a little bit just broadly. We're going to dig into each in a minute, but tell me just broadly how you look at these and kind of balance them in your organization.
Well, we look at kind of related to what you had talked about earlier, Craig, is how does the impact of COVID and this hybrid workplace impact where people are working from? How do they work with third parties? How do we evaluate how third parties are handling the situation, and what technologies are being used to, compensate for any kind of risk that may have kind of transpired as part of this situation. At the beginning part of COVID, there were a lot of organizations and technology companies that were offering new technologies that would help the situation with people working from remote places, not on their core, secure networks, but at their homes and integrating into the core networks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let me go to Tim, I'm going to come to you on this slide. So these are some tips. We wrote a guide recently, and these are some of the basic tips for managers if you're thinking about your workforce. One is about passwords. That we actually advocate 16-character passwords and to use multi-factor authentication. Phishing, to just give people updates on that. There's been a lot of phishing attempts specifically tied to COVID-19. USB use. Here's a real challenge for people. If I need to go back and forth from my home to the office, I may or may not have a company issued laptop. I may or may not, when I'm working from home, I might be using my personal device sometime. How do I transfer files? And what if my company doesn't have cloud-based file sharing? Am I using USBs? And then finally, software updates. And here again, this is tied to devices, right? Because a lot of companies did not or do not provide devices, laptops or desktops or tablets for all their employees. So the employees could be expected to be using a personal device. How do you control or get them to update the software? So Tim, I'm going to turn this over to you now. In terms of some of these like broad things, these are our 4 core issues. What do you see here, and what are some of the recommendations you would make?
Sure, Craig. So, these aren't particularly anything new to us, but they've certainly become elevated concerns in the pandemic era that we're living in today. As you noted, the bad actors are well aware of these vulnerabilities, and the increased likelihood that they will encounter users working from home that don't have the security layers in place that they would in a corporate environment. There may be more. Phishing is going to be a larger concern for them for sure. And again, just touching on that, 9 out of 10 compromises begin with a phish. So we just can't pay too much attention to that. Mm-hmm. But stepping back and looking at this from 20,000 feet, now again, like I mentioned, we're in a renaissance, and we have a chance to rethink how we're handling the remote workforce. And a lot of this just needs to be policy driven, and that goes to the to the people part of this discussion, where it's absolutely essential to set expectation for user behavior. Some of these points don't necessarily occur to people. They may feel safe and isolated, away from the company, and its controls, in the safety of their home. The reality is that they're more vulnerable. And again, the bad actors know this. So policies, policies, policies. There are a lot of great examples out there, and guidance, much like what you're seeing here with CRI. And it's just super key that, we pay attention to this. We ensure that our end user community working from home is aware, and they're aware that really they are an extension of the workplace. It's not, I'm away from home. It's like, no, you're working from home, but you're very much still a piece of the company. And, that posture needs to be maintained.
Absolutely. And that's a good transition, because when we think about the people side of it, one of the things that we think about is that we need to have people develop good habits. So we're going to do a polling question here now, get the results of this, and we'll talk about the results and then move on to a little bit of discussion on the people issue. So here, employees have a clear understanding of what is expected of them regarding cybersecurity and data protection as they work remotely or rotate between remote and company locations. So do you strongly agree with this, strongly disagree, or somewhere in between? And what we see, I'll just tell a little bit while people are filling this out, is in that initial rush phase, a lot of companies brought in new technology. They were maybe buying, putting VPNs or expanding VPN use, but they didn't always tell the people how to use it effectively. And so there was a rush toward acquiring technology, but the telling people how to use it effectively kind of lagged behind a little bit. So let's see what we have here. So if we look, it's primarily in the middle. So interesting distribution here. Tim, I'll start with you this time about the communicating clear expectations. Let's start. What do you see here, and talk about the importance of that?
Well, it's an interesting statistical spread. The full spectrum is represented there. And, really, I think that speaks to the diversity and the maturity of the IT programs across the many businesses here in Hawaii. If you didn't have a remote working policy before, you're probably working on one now, or it will soon be in place.
Maverick, what about you? Any observations on this?
Yeah, we're in the same manner. Your point about having that training was a key one. We were in the transition of utilizing Teams, and we continue to have weekly sessions where we have short 15-minute training on how people are using the technology and how it's assisting them in the business. And we continuously are kind of assessing that and trying to optimize that. So trying to look at that from the perspective of where they're working and how they're using technology, and adjust continuously in this new environment has been something that has helped considerably and a good practice.
That's great. So Vivek, we can close that poll out now. So I mentioned before, what is cyber readiness? And it's really to create a culture of cyber readiness that spans locations and covers all the people. Because the culture in your company can span a location. It does not have to be specific to a location. And the other thing is that the people's habits need to also span locations and devices. So that if I'm using personal devices or to access work, I need to be consistent in how I'm using them and the behavior I have. So what I'm going to talk about quickly here is culture. We're trying to get to this culture piece. Well, culture is, how do you get culture is we want people to behave a certain way. We want them to behave in accordance with our policies. But if you boil that down, it's really helping people develop good habits. And seatbelts are a good example. 20, 30 years ago, it was a big deal to get people to wear seatbelts in cars. There was a lot of public service campaigns about it. Then they put in those annoying little beeps or chimes if you don't have the seatbelt buckled. So the technology, the beep, assisted people to develop a habit. And now with my kids, I watch, they immediately reach for the seatbelt when they get in a car, whether they're a driver or a passenger. It's a habit. So that's what we need with individuals. And once you have enough people with good habits, that changes the culture. And it reaches a tipping point in the culture where new people come in, they see the way other people behave, and they follow that same behavior. So that's really what we want with people, is get people to develop good habits. So here are a couple good habits that we recommend, and then I'm going to turn this over to Tim and Maverick to see if they have others that are specific. But one is to log off your computer when you step away from it, right? If it's a laptop, close it down, put your desktop to sleep, make sure it takes a password or a biometric to get it back open. Use multi-factor authentication every day. A lot of people say that in the beginning, they don't really understand how to use multi-factor authentication. And if you use it,
I found this on the web.
if you only use it, where'd that come from? If you only use it once a month, it's unknown to you and unfamiliar. If you get in the habit of making a purpose of trying to use it every day for a month, then suddenly it becomes a habit. Strengthen a password one per day. Verify that you have backups. And another thing in a company is ask other people how they're doing with their cyber readiness. So if you're on a Zoom call or a Teams call with people in your company, ask them how they're doing. And that's one way to start to build up that communication between people and start to change the culture toward one that is paying attention to cyber readiness. So with that, I'll start with you this time, Maverick. What do you see here in maybe some habits that you think people should embrace in a hybrid work environment?
Well, it's passwords are a key one. One of the things we try to do is when we provide some training is show them not only the workspace, but how that also ties to their personal stuff. So like you mentioned, with the passwords and the multi-factor, a lot of people, when they're going through and they're doing their banking, a lot of banking institutions, when you're paying your bills from home, offer that as an additional factor. So using it in your personal life also helps reinforce it in the workplace. So we try to make that tie between, work and how those habits actually help in your personal life and the way you use technology in a personal factor.
Tim, what about you? What would you like to highlight here?
Well, I'm going to focus on passwords here as well. This is like the bane of our existence, right? You may deal with 50 or 100 different applications between home and work, and just trying to keep that, let's call it what it is. It's a mess. Keeping that mess straight is a challenge, particularly when your best practice is a long password, a complex password, and a different password for every service or application that you're using. So I think the point here for me is that if you've not heard of, or if you're not using password managers, please spend some time and learn about that. In the corporate space, this is something that you may want to encourage your organization to just make standard operating procedure, in the same way that you issue software tools to people in support of business need. Password management is a component that is it's just there. It's part of your life every day. Again, these tools, they transcend. They're part of your personal, part of your professional life, and getting comfortable with them and understanding how they work is key.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's really a key thing that you mentioned. And the length of the password. Earlier in the cyber readiness and Cyber Hawaii webinar, I think it was one of the FBI agents showed a slide that an 8-character password, if hackers put a lot of computing power, they can crack an 8-character password in 3 minutes. But if it's a 12-character password, it takes 35 years. So the difference, every character that you add makes it exponentially harder. And the other thing that we believe, and I'll ask both of you if you agree, is if you have a longer password, 15 characters, 16 characters, we don't think you ever have to change it unless it's been breached. So the days of needing to change it every 3 months, which drives me crazy, it used to drive me crazy, because inevitably I'd be getting off a plane and I'd get a notice I needed to update all my passwords. What do you think about that? If it's longer, would you say it's okay to leave it forever unless it's been breached?
So yeah, Craig, this hasn't proliferated very well, but the NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technologies, actually updated their position on password management a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that's precisely what the recommendation is that you use very long, very complex passwords, passphrases, and they're changed when there's suspicion of compromise.
Right.
And the issue there is that, a 30-day or a 90-day password reset cycle actually introduces risk through increased management.
I agree completely. And also user error. And it gets at the impractical, which we're going to get into the next piece here, is implementing practical policies that people will actually follow. Because it's great to have policies that people don't follow. And I go into so many organizations that have what I would call a workaround culture, where they have good intention and they have some policies that are in place, but nobody really pays attention to them. So what we want to ask you now in this next polling is, have you actually, your company, updated the policies based on the hybrid work environment? Have you gone back since you have more people remote? And I think it was 84% of you now have a hybrid work environment. Have you actually gone back and updated the cyber and data protection policies and procedures? Because if they're not updated, then it's another gateway to people ignoring them. Because if people look at it and they say, well, this doesn't work anymore. This policy was okay when I was just in the office, but now that I'm not just in the office, it's no good. That's almost worse than not having a policy. So you do need to kind of keep these things updated and adapt them to the reality of what people are doing now. How are we doing on this one, Vivek? Okay. Tim, I'll start with you. Any comments on this result?
It's interesting. It seems to be somewhat polarized. And I completely understand this. Policy development or modification is probably not at the top of everyone's list in the midst of what we'll call an emergency response to a remote working surge. To that point, though, again, I said earlier, the setting expectations for behavior is key. Mm-hmm. Your users may or may not understand what best practices are or what's being asked of them in their remote workplace. So this is a very important thing to do, not just to update, but to your point earlier, the communication, the marketing of those policies and making sure that people read them in the first place, but secondly, understand what they're reading. And they can translate that into actions and behavior that's in the best interest of security for the organization.
Yeah, I agree. And Maverick, you brought up a good point before, is that it spans also for the individual. It's not only helping them at work, but it's helping them in their personal life. So what do you see when you look at the idea of updating policies? Did your organization go through that? Let me ask you that.
Yeah, we did. I know one of the things too is understanding how people were working in the workplace and how that transposes to working at home. key things like printing out confidential documents and how they go about disposing of that, in a secure way. Those are key things that we've kind of have to identify and manage and communicate that so that people understand that, oh, okay, I printed this thing. Make sure that, in this open space where you have family members or guests coming into the house, that there is still a consideration of trying to protect that information that's critical to your organization.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So when we think about process, basically process, if you look at business process, it's linking activities to achieve a goal. So, and what we're trying to do, the process is also what links the behavior and the technology. So I kind of look at it as it's like the in between, and it's the rules. So the foundational piece of process are the policies, as Tim mentioned before, and that's what you want to use to shape how people behave. So making them practical is the single most important thing. So the way to make it practical, and if I look at a company that has good cyber culture, the policies typically were developed with input from different departments and technology skill levels. They're easy to understand. They don't have a lot of technical language, and they're practical for people to do their job, work in a hybrid environment, and still be able to follow these policies. When I go into a workaround culture, the policies typically are impractical. There's insufficient training, and there's the attitude in the company that it's okay to ignore the policies, especially maybe for certain people in certain departments, things like that. And I'll tell you one quick story, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Tim and Maverick. Mid-sized manufacturer, they had a clear no USB policy. However, when we looked at it, we found that the sales engineers routinely use USBs. And I said, well, why do you do that? And they said, well, we use it because when we go out to a potential client, they often will give us a USB with the drawings that we need to bring back and quote on. And we're never going to tell a client we're not going to take the USB. So I went to the IT department. I said, do you know this is happening? And they said, well, no, we didn't. We kind of knew, but we didn't really know. And I said, well, you can't. So what was happening though is that other departments like finance was seeing that the salespeople used it. And so they were using USBs to take work home over the weekends. So you had a no USB policy, but you have a culture of people using USBs routinely. That's not good. So you either need to find a way to change the policy or change the behavior. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I'll start with Maverick this time. How do you go about making policies practical for people?
Well, one of the things we try to assess is how effective and practical the policies for the business to operate. Because it's like you mentioned, if it's not functional for them, then it doesn't become practical and they find ways around it. So it's a delicate balance to understand what's the risk and what is the business value and try to adjust that so that it is practical. The other thing is making sure that the employees understand where policies are posted and how often they're there. Because what happens is that they take a look at it one time, but as the policies get updated, they're not aware of those. So it's important that they understand where to look for those policies and how often to look at them to manage and understand when updates are being made.
That's a really good point. Tim, what about you? What do you think about this?
I would first just echo Maverick's sentiment there about the marketing and the communication part of it. Your users are not going to prioritize the reading of IT policies in their daily to-do list. Right. This just won't come naturally to people. So, it's key that when those changes are made, that they know what they are, how it affects them, where they can go for more information, where they can, seek training if necessary. So that's a very important point. Back to your point though, Craig, I would also add that, policy development, that's an art. It's a bit of an art, mm-hmm. I believe. And you mentioned, I believe you mentioned stakeholder involvement. Right. And, over the years, that's really something that I've seen as key. when IT policy is developed with the business instead of for the business, you get people's involvement, you get their buy-in, and those policies, they seem easier for people to align with.
I agree completely, and that's really where you're able to make sure that you're not going to create a policy that is impossible for a certain department to follow. Like in the example I used of the manufacturing, the no USB policy. Had they just even talked to the salespeople and found out that that was such a routine way that they did business, they would have had to have come up with a way to change the policy or provide some kind of alternative. So getting people to follow policies. So, and this does get at what Maverick and Tim mentioned about communication. And the other thing is, I like to be upfront with people. I would tell the workers, the employees, you're going to have to change some habits. There are no two ways about it. You are going to have to learn some new habits. And the way that we look at that is through training, initial training, and then reinforced by frequent short communications. And I'll give you one trip for training and one for communication, and then go back to Maverick and Tim. But when we do training around the world, I always think about 3 steps to it: to build awareness of the issue, to gain commitment from them on why it's important, and then teach them how to do it. And I see a lot of training that doesn't include all 3 steps, and it usually fails in changing people's behavior. You can't just tell people how to do something if they don't know why they're doing it. So you want to build awareness. What's the issue? Gain their commitment. Yeah, this is important. And then you can teach them how to do it. And it doesn't take a long time. The employee training that we're going to put together is going to go through these 3: awareness, commitment, how to, in something like for passwords in 2 minutes. It doesn't have to be long, but it has to cover these topics. And then one tip for communication: if you look at behavioral science, people typically are only able to change one habit at a time or one behavior at a time. So one thing we recommend is have a monthly theme for cyber readiness. So this could be the month of the password. This could be the month of software updates, so on and so forth. So that way it becomes focused around one behavior instead of throwing 10 things at people that you want them to try to change at the same time. I'll start with you this time, Tim. What do you think about getting people to follow the policies?
I think it's an ongoing challenge, and there are so many dimensions here. The way that the policy was written, how digestible and legible it is for the users. How the organization is when it comes to being serious about requiring review and buy-in from people. I always, pragmatically, everything that I do, I like feedback loops on, and I don't want to invest time and effort and money into things that don't provide business value. And so I like to measure things. I like metrics, and I think that's important too, is that organizations step back, and once they put these programs in place, which may consist of policy and training and marketing and communication programs, that they take the time to measure the effectiveness. Is our approach working? Are our users, we're disseminating the information, but are our users understanding what we're saying? Are they making that part of their, part of their work habit?
You and I think alike on that. In fact, one of the things that my colleagues get tired of me saying is, you can't improve what you don't measure. And that measurement piece, I think, is so critical to helping to understand what's actually going on in it, in the workplace. Maverick, what do you think about getting people to follow policies?
I think the other point that you mentioned was really key, is having the right people engaged, the right stakeholders to participate as part of that. One of the things we did was about a year ago, revamp the policies and adjusted them to the level of the people that are engaged and have more practical engagement or information that's pertinent to a policy together at the table while we go through and we revamp. We push some of the policies down to procedure levels so that they have more input to adjust them at the right level. And I think that was key. The other thing is having that training part that you had and adjusting the training so that it's small and applicable to the appropriate groups. So splitting up the training so that it's more focused on the groups that it applies to, and delivering it in that method is the other good thing that we've noticed.
Yeah, that's really key. That scenario-based training is so important. You know, in a school situation, the teachers don't need the exact same training that the administrators do, because they're dealing with different types of technology, different risks and things like that. So the last part, or no, actually we want to do this and then a little bit on ransomware, but demystifying the technology. So that's one of the themes at CRI, is how do we demystify technology? I've got to say that the cybersecurity has to be one of the most acronym heavy fields I've ever run into. I mean, it's up there with the military or defense industry or things like that. It's unbelievable the number of acronyms that people come up with. And that makes it more confusing for non-technical people. So we're going to do a polling question now. And this is really to get a feel. And in this one, it's select all that apply. So we provide our employees with the following technology to facilitate cybersecurity in the new hybrid workplace. And the company issued router or hotspot is interesting. Specifically, while you're filling this out, you know, in some of the city environments, like in New York, hackers actually have been going, looking at apartment buildings and skimming through all the Wi-Fi networks in apartment buildings. They can do it from outside. And they know that most people never change the password on their router. So if I get it from whoever, Cablevision or Comcast or whatever it is, I've probably never changed the password on my router. They are starting to systematically go through apartment buildings and look for routers that they can crack. So that's the level of sophistication on the hacker side. The other thing that somebody mentioned to me is that they were advocating that people at working from home actually segment or segregate their home Wi-Fi network. Now, I don't think I know anybody that's done that. I know some people that have a guest versus they have their own family versus the guest network in their home Wi-Fi. But I don't think I know anybody that has one for dad, one for mom, and then a separate segregated network for each of the kids in the family. Tim or Maverick, what do you think about that home like network segregation?
Well, I think if you're a network engineer, then it's a lot simpler to understand. And you know, this reminded me, Craig. Early on in March or so, when organizations had to consider how to send people home to work, I saw a network diagram that was a recommendation for how people should implement wireless networks within their own home to segregate their business traffic and their private traffic. And I found this diagram confusing. And I think that the average user, maybe non-technical user, would look at that recommendation and just be utterly confused, and then in turn do nothing.
Right.
So I think there are simpler, more reasonable approaches to securing home networks. I'm not sure that those architectures are well shared. Certainly everybody can go hit a search engine and find out, but you want reputable information as well too. So, I know that we can provide that here. Mid-size and larger organizations are going to have capable IT departments that will be able to advise on this.
Right. So, Maverick, what do you see? Let's take a look at this. These results. It's some interesting things here. What jumps out to you?
Well, it's kind of interesting, the cloud-based file sharing. There's been a big push for cloud-based applications and cloud-based technology, which is interesting. It's a shift from, the core corporate network.
Mhm.
And that kind of goes back to your earlier point about having, third parties or other solutions that you work with, and how important it is to understand and assess the risk around those, have good practices when utilizing those kind of third-party technologies and third-party partners.
Absolutely. Tim, what do you see before we hop ahead?
I'm actually very excited to see that the company issued computers, that's so prevalent.
Yeah.
That's fantastic because,
Yep.
again, back in March and April, good luck trying to find a laptop at a local electronic or off of an online reseller.
Right.
In a lot of organizations, again, 911 moment, you had to get people productive. Security took a back seat to that, and a lot of people were using personal computers, which are not managed by IT departments, and they may have vulnerabilities. They may not be patched regularly.
Right.
That's a huge concern. So this is fantastic. I'm very happy to see this number so high.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's one of the things that if they can afford it, that's one thing a company can do that does help to minimize their risk. I'm a little surprised that the VPN is only about 50%, because that's another thing that a lot of companies jump toward pretty quickly, was virtual private networks. But okay, let's go ahead, Vivek. So when we think about technology, we think about devices, and this is how I would suggest you think about it. What devices are people using? What connections? How are they connecting to your network? And then what data are they accessing, transferring, and storing? And one of the things from a user standpoint is with cloud-based file sharing, you do have to train people, because I see, and I've been involved in directly, so I have personal pain tied to this. When companies switch to a cloud-based file sharing, a lot of organizations, it's not 100% all at one time. And so there could still be some documents over here, some documents over there, some documents on my personal laptop, my company issued laptop. That creates a lot of version control problems and a huge amount of issues that go into where is the document. And then you find out that people end up emailing it back and forth to each other anyway, because they can't find it in the shared files. So if you do shift, or as you're shifting toward cloud-based, spend the time to get it organized, spend the time to train people on how to use it effectively, I think is just one practical tip I would give people. And then what I'm going to do now is go back to you, the two of you, to talk about anything that you see here. This is really just a repeat of the polling that we did. Anything else you'd like to comment, or I can go back to this other slide. Anything you'd like to comment here? I'll start with you this time, Tim.
Okay, so there's some spillover from this topic onto your next slide. And I would talk about USBs devices a little bit in file sharing. So I think there's two sides of this. In most use cases, really the use of USB storage devices, that's an obsolete approach. There are too many pitfalls, too many security concerns, and too many viable workarounds. So, I would like to see people not even put this on the list of the top 10 ways they want to exchange data with each other. Mm-hmm. There are ways to do this. However, to your point, and to the survey data that came up a little while ago, cloud-based file sharing has become mainstream. A lot of people are using this. And on the training component, I totally agree with you on that. It's a necessary step within an organization to get them to understand how to effectively use the tools. Where this gets complicated is when your organization starts exchanging data with other organizations, because there isn't one cloud-based file sharing standard that everybody uses. The reality is that there are several different tools that can facilitate this from different vendors, and they all look and feel a little bit different. And I've seen this become an attack vector too for phishing campaigns. where you'll receive an email that says, you have a new file uploaded on OneDrive from so-and-so at a different organization. So we also have to be very careful about how we choose to engage these online file sharing tools, particularly when they're with other organizations on different platforms.
Really good point. Really good point. Maverick, what about you? What do you see?
Actually, your other slide there, I think that's a very good slide, and kind of things to consider. I think the key thing is the data too, because that's the corporate asset, and having an understanding of what is, the key part, the confidential versus the non-confidential piece, and not trying to secure everything, but secure the part that is the data value that you want to protect. The devices is having an understanding between the corporate and the non-corporate. One of the things we do is limit the capabilities on personal devices versus the corporate. Corporate is more trusted, so it has full capabilities to download and edit and change and stuff. If you have a non-corporate, we kind of adjust it and limit the access, so you may be able to view but not edit or do stuff like that. And then, the connection part is making sure, like your last comment about the VPN access and how you secure connections to the corporate environment, or depending on where they're accessing. So I like this diagram, and talks about those key parts. And then in the center is that individual, and how do we authenticate and make sure that the person who's accessing all of that information is truly that person.
That's a great way to look at it. So before we wrap up, just real quickly on ransomware. Ransomware, we actually wrote a guide, and I'll show you, and all this stuff is available for free at our website. So I'm going to encourage you to go to our website. You can download guides, you can go through the program, but ransomware, prepare, respond, and recover. And I'm going to give you, I'll cut to the chase on this. If you are well prepared with backups that have been tested, that are relatively current, you can, by and large, tell the ransomware people to get lost, right? Because you have the data that they're trying to hold hostage. You have it stored over here. They've got your system over here held hostage, but you have a backup over here. So that's the piece. And if we look here at this decision tree, and I know this is hard to see in this, but by and large, if you are going down this left-hand side, it's a pretty quick path down to resetting user IDs, changing passwords, and reinstalling from the backup. If you don't have a good backup, you're ending up in all this mess over here in the upper right, and all this over here. Do we have insurance? A host of other things that are going to come into play. So I'm going to turn this back over to Tim and Maverick real quick. We only have a minute left on this, so just real quick on ransomware, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Jen.
I would echo all that, Craig. Absolutely, backups are key. Make sure you're doing it, but don't just run the backup and say problem solved. You've got to validate that backup, meaning that you need to make sure that you're actually backing up the data that you need to be backing up. And probably most importantly, I can recover a backup. So you've backed it up. Now let's see if you can actually, if that tape or whatever mechanism that you use will actually work to recover the data. You have to test that.
Maverick?
The other key thing is most folks have an incident response plan. One of the things we did was, given the new scenario and new workplace, this remote workplace, is pull that off, dust it off, and test it. Because you are going to execute, if that scenario does occur, you are going to run through those steps. But given this new workplace, new environment, it'd be good to validate that that's still applicable. So that would be my other recommendation, along with what the great suggestions both Tim and yourself made.
That's great. So let me now go turn it back over to you, Jen, to wrap
Hi,
it up.
Craig, before we do that.
Yeah, Vivek.
Hi, Craig, can you hear me? We have we have two questions in Q&A. If we want to spend a minute or two to answer those before we close the webinar.
Sure. Do you want to
Sure.
read out the first question?
Yes. So the first question is, and this is regarding the USB policy. So what is our position on external drive as they provided with an external drive versus USB? So they don't understand the difference between the USB or external drive. So if you can explain that regarding the USB policy.
Tim, do you want to handle that one about using removable hard drives versus USB?
Yeah, sure.
Do you see them as
So
the same?
I think from 20,000 feet, whether it's a thumb drive that'll fit in your shirt pocket, or whether it's a 4 terabyte USB drive that plugs in and sits up on your desk and takes up a lot of space. Fundamentally, these are the same things. They are USB storage devices. And, in general, my opinion on that is that, that use should be discouraged. If you need a large capacity drive on your desk, my first question to my IT department would be, well, isn't there a better way to provision storage for me? I wouldn't say that there's never a use case that exists for USB drives, but it just shouldn't be the first go-to solution.
And then Vivek, the next question.
The next question is, so you during in the target of whole COVID situation, U.S. hospitals are targeted in the rising wave of ransomware attacks. So what efforts are, I think Cyber Hawaii team is aware of, that Hawaii Hospital are making to respond to ransomware attacks?
Jen or Jill or Maverick, are you familiar with anything the hospitals are doing, or Tim, in hospitals are doing in Hawaii about ransomware attacks?
I know that the local FBI office has been the community engagement part of the FBI, have been very involved with both at the health research companies, hospital and healthcare providers, as well as governments. They've been working closely with them to give them information and help them understand the risk. A lot of those companies also doing some kind of a internal assessment to understand where their risks are and try to mitigate them. And I also know that a lot of insurance providers are also kind of trying to increase the awareness and the security for a lot of their clients around ransomware, because they're seeing such a high spike in that.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Maverick. I think that's exactly correct. Our FBI has been active locally to be sure that our partners are all engaged in the health side. We're at the 10 o'clock hour, so thank you all for participating and listening in. As you can see, there was a host of information, way more, I think, than would fit nicely into 1 hour. And so we have scheduled a second webinar on this topic that will be on November 10th at 10 o'clock. And we're going to dive more into the specifics of some of the topics that have been raised and that members would like to have a little bit more information on. So as we wrap up, I want to thank our members, Maverick and Tim, for providing their time and their counsel to our members. And of course, Cyber Hawaii loves the Cyber Readiness Institute. We are great partners together. And as Craig was sharing, we do look forward to an additional partnership as we work together on a cyber awareness campaign with the target on the employees of Hawaii and making sure that our community is safe. So again, on behalf of Cyber Hawaii, thank you all for joining and have a great, safe day. Aloha.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.